So if you're going to practice, it's a really good idea to practice with a metronome, at least for some of what you're doing. And there are a bunch of reasons why. So I want to just explain a few of the reasons and make a couple suggestions about how to do it. That's all I'm here to do. So the first thing about it is that the metronome, it's all about time, right? I mean, that's what it's doing. The metronome is a way to quantify and calibrate time. So if you practice without a metronome, here's an example. Like if you were learning to play slide guitar, something where there's no frets and you don't have a way to, the only way to calculate the pitch is by listening. You would have to practice along with a jam track or some kind of something that would tell you this is where the chords are, this is where pitch is, so you can learn to put the pitches with the slide where they belong. It's the same thing with time. If you're practicing and you want to have good time when you play, then you need something to tell you where time is. That's what the metronome does. It's calibrating things for you. So the other analogy is like if you were going to put a new door in your house or in a room, you probably wouldn't just eyeball it and go like, well, I'll start cutting here and I'll start cutting here. I'll make a hole that's like a door, and then I'll hope the door kind of fits. You would measure the door, you would use a T-square or whatever you need to do to make sure, and a level to make sure all the lines are vertical and horizontal. I mean, I know that's not how you really cut a door because I don't know how to do that, but you know what I mean. Someone out there knows how to do that like really awesomely, and they're gonna, this is how you do it. But you would need to calibrate, you need to measure like the width of the door, the height of the door, to make sure the lines are vertical and parallel and perpendicular and all that. So the metronome does that for you. It tells you this is where the pulse is. This is where time is. It shows you where the beats are. So the next thing is, if you're going to use the metronome, the metronome is not aspirational. You don't set the metronome where you want to play at the tempo you want to play at. You set it as slowly as you need to be able to play everything that you're working on. So I don't know if you remember that term, the lowest common denominator, from when you're studying math. So what you want with the metronome is the slowest common denominator. If you're playing a piece, you want to set the metronome as slowly as the hardest part of the piece, or the hardest part of the exercise, or the hardest part of the lick you're working on, so that when you're playing along to the metronome, you can play the hardest part in time without dropping the beat. And the thing you don't want to do is play the easy parts fast and then the hard parts slow, because then things will be out of proportion. So you need to set the metronome as slowly as you need to play the hardest part that you're working on, and hold yourself to that tempo even for the parts you already know. And then when you can do that, then you can gradually bring the tempo up, and your playing will come along with it, even if you only move it a couple of clicks at a time. The next thing is, one thing that can really help if you're working on playing roots music is to learn how to hear the metronome on beats 2 and 4 only. So I actually have a metronome here on my phone. I'm going to just show you what I mean. Let's say you're working at this tempo, and maybe you're playing and you're working on that groove. So right now I've got it at 116 beats per minute. Now half of that, I should have done something easier. Let's see. Half of 120 is 60, so half of 116 is 58. So if I go to 58, now I've got this. So it's the same thing basically, but it's only clicking every other beat. Now that's playing it with the beats on 1 and 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But if you think about the If you think about the backbeat in most groove music, the snare hits on 2 and 4. So if you can hear the metronome as 2 and 4, it'll help you play with a better groove. So if you just start the click again, but now you try to hear it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. now you're starting to feel the emphasis on 2 and 4. So it can does two things. One is, you're hearing the weight where it belongs in a lot of roots music, and also, well, it's a little tricky to start to actually hear that, to start to hear the click. You have to kind of basically play it, and just when you hear it, just start thinking 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's kind of the way to jump into it, is to just start calling that first click 2, and then sort of get around to the next measure. But it helps you put the weight on 2 and 4, and it also brings the metronome closer to a musical experience. Because now you're hearing the click like the way you would hear part of the rhythm section, the way you'd hear the snare. So, or the mandolin chop in bluegrass or whatever kind of music you're playing has some kind of element that lands on 2 and 4 for most kinds of blues and R&B and country and folk and everything else. So, in order to do that, one other sort of tip is if you can find a metronome, if you're not using a mechanical one, if you're using a digital one, where you can set the clicks to all one sound. Like a lot of metronomes do this, where there's a higher pitched one for the first beat, and that's just kind of, if you want to do this 2 and 4 thing, that can be really hard to get it to sound right. So, oh, come on. Where are you? There we go. So if you can set it up so that all the clicks sound exactly the same, then it makes it easier to do that 2 and 4 thing. So that next thing is, if you're working on improvising and you're improvising 2 jam tracks, like I mentioned with the slide thing, even if you're doing that, it's still a really good idea to spend some time using just the metronome, because the whole name of the game with practicing, to me, is isolating. Isolating specific things, specific aspects of what you're working on, so that you can really focus on them, and then integrating that isolated thing back into the whole process. So, maybe when you're learning a scale, you're not so worried about playing in time. You're really isolating the fingering. Like, you really want to, focus on which finger goes on what note. But once you know the scale, and you're practicing it, and if you're trying to bring it up to tempo or get it under your fingers, then you do want to isolate the time aspect of it, because you want to make sure the notes are all evenly spaced, because that's part of playing in time. It might not be how you end up executing it, because you're not going to just run the scale. But if you're working on a groove in particular, then you do need to have the proportions between the notes to be all right. That's what makes it a groove, is to have all the notes spaced out the way they're supposed to be. So playing with a metronome, there isn't you're isolating the time aspect, and you're not getting distracted by the groove of the rhythm section, or the sound of the rhythm section, really, because a jam track makes everything sound better. And if it's just you and the metronome, then it's up to you to sound good. So isolating the time by playing with just a metronome instead of playing along to records or to a jam track is, I think, an important idea. And so the final thing is, the first person I heard talk about this playing on 2 and 4 was the bass player, the jazz bass player, Michael Moore. And he talked about this when I was taking a summer class at Eastman when I was a kid. And somebody raised their hand, and they were like, well, how do you know when you're doing it right, playing with a metronome? He said, when the metronome sounds like it's swinging. So if you can get that 2 and 4 to sound really groovy when you're playing, then you know that you're doing it right. So you get your metronome on your 2 and 4, and you try to get it to... Whether that sounds swinging or not is totally subjective, but you want to just get to the place where the metronome feels good. And, if your only experiences with the metronome so far have been chasing after the tempo at a piano lesson, this is a completely different way of looking at the metronome. It's a tool that's there to help you calibrate the time, to help you feel the groove, and to help you isolate your time as a thing to work on and to help you figure out how you can help to be part of making things groove. So those are some thoughts about how to practice with the metronome. If you got any questions, you got any comments, leave them for me down below, and I'll see you next time.